Hello noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and on this platform we usually focus on military history in classical antiquity, in the medieval period, all the way up to the early modern period, but we don't really go past that. Well, today is an exception, and for good reason. Just a day ago, I reacted to this video by Kentucky Ballistic, where he was, very fun video by the way, where he was using early medieval firearms and testing them against a medieval breastplate. And regardless, it was a fantastic video, I had a great time. But during that video, at one point, I presented an image of a breastplate that had received cannon fire, just to have an idea. And the reason why I used that picture is because the day before, during a live stream on Twitch, one of our great supporters, Greg, actually mentioned the breastplate. And if you open your Google and you write breastplate destroyed by cannonball, here is what you get. 360 degree, you'll get every single possible angle. It's a relatively famous / infamous, more on that later, picture. Now, this is a real chest plate and it's currently on display in a museum, specifically the, I wrote a note, Musée de l'Armée in Paris. Now, the reason why I was telling you that it's both famous and infamous is because people have been debating over this for a very long time, and you can find a lot of information on the piece. Here's the thing. I looked into this, and one of the problems I have with this piece specifically is the fact that the information you find, the descriptions of every single picture change. People keep adding stuff that I think they're just making up. For instance, this is once again allegedly belonging to a cavalryman during the Battle of Waterloo, we are told. We have been given name and surname of this individual. Some people say he was as young as 19. Ooh, shock factor. And then people write, breastplate belonging to a cavalryman in the Napoleonic Wars, blah, 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 died on impact. That sentence alone annoys me. Why does it annoy me? Because it's a very strong statement to make if you don't have sources to back it up. Now, given the reason why people make stuff up is because they see this and they think, well, there is no way someone would survive that. But the reality of fact is that if you spend time with the sources, period sources, and of course today we will, people have survived stuff that is unbelievable. Of course, among the sources we will read, we'll also read about a Navy officer that got completely decapitated by a cannonball. In that case, I would say died on the spot is probably a safe assumption. But when it comes to this, we don't know. Unless you present the sources, you can't make a statement like that because someone could die on the spot. Imagine like the sort of shock that you would go into. I mean, you probably lost a lung. I mean, the tissue damage alone. But there are situations where people died a few hours later. There are situations where people died a few days later. And there are situations where people's limbs were pulverized and yet they survived and died just weeks later, if not months later, if not years later. So it's kind of crazy, and it really is a case-by-case scenario. Now, since I mentioned period sources, let's begin by saying what period we are talking about. We are, of course, discussing 19th century warfare, specifically in the context of artillery, and to be even more specific, field artillery. And we'll go deeper and deeper into this. But first, let me kind of give you the dates. Napoleonic Wars, of course, we are discussing very early 19th century, so between 1803 and 1815. In fact, some of the injuries we will discuss today and read, it's going to get a little macabre, it's going to get a little intense, so I'm just letting you know. Then again, 1815 is, a lot of information comes from this date specifically. But also, let's keep in mind that when we talk about 19th century warfare, clearly one cannot help but mentioning the American Civil War, which occurred between 1861 and 1865. I would imagine we could classify as mid-19th century, and even though the type of weaponry had changed not only spatially, America versus the continent, but also time-wise, a good 50 years, things do change, but still, it's all 19th century warfare. Next thing that we should introduce, or the next parameter, should be the type of shot that we're talking about. Now, generally speaking, in 19th century artillery, field artillery, there were 4 different types of shots that were used, but the one that we're going to focus on today is the most common, the round shot. So basically, the iron cannonball. When I say iron, it's not always iron. Occasionally, they did use stone projectile, but that doesn't matter because it's not what's being claimed for this breastplate. So let's just focus on the iron round shot. The sizes of these balls varied. You could have a 6-pounder, you could have a 12-pounder. Of course, the effective range of these projectiles would depend on the sort of gun that was used to shoot. And then there are different ways in which a cannonball can interfere with enemy lines. For instance, you can have a direct shot, clearly the one that in this case is being discussed. Someone got hit directly. Those are usually the most powerful. But when it comes to dangers on a field, a ricochet is extremely dangerous. Even getting hit by a man that was thrown onto you because he was hit, but you weren't, but you got hit by the guy, that is also very dangerous. Sometimes you've got shots that just, or cannonballs that just keep moving onto the battlefield, and believe it or not, they cause a lot of damage. They can destroy other artillery, they can hit wooden barrels that contain ammunition and disrupt them. They can in fact fracture limbs, kill horses, shatter bones, and occasionally, as we will read, sometimes soldiers did try to stop a moving ball and they lost their foot, which needed to be amputated. So it gets really nasty and ghastly. But there is one article in particular that we will be reading in the second part of this video, still today, and it's this one here, written by a gentleman by the name of David Vidicet, and it's very well written, and it's called "Is the World's Most Famous Piece of Armor a Fake?" So, as you remember, I did tell you this is a little bit of a debated topic, I imagine, and that is because I was bringing up this gentleman's article. Now, he is not a historian, he's not a military historian. However, his expertise is interesting when it comes to this discussion today. Of course, I'll put all the links in the description, because if we click About Me, we'll see that he's an investigator and writer. As an investigator, David had worked on a wealth of famous cases. He's cached numerous dangerous criminals and interviewed thousands of witnesses. So this guy has direct true crime investigation experience directly when it comes to law enforcement. So yeah, so it's interesting that he's investigating it from, we could say, a little bit of a different perspective than usual. Now, with that being said, I don't actually agree with everything he says. He brings up a good point. I don't think it's one of those cases where you read this and then you're like, oh, this is clearly a fake. It does raise the question, and he, as I say, does a very good job at doing that. However, specifically when he talks about the injuries themselves, I have a feeling that he hasn't read a lot of sources when it comes to, once again, 19th century description from eyewitnesses of what the sort of bullets and cannonball shots that they were using could cause. I could be wrong. I'm not trying to be disrespectful, of course. I'm just hoping to create a little bit of a debate opportunity here. But I don't want to read this without preparing us and have a little bit of an understanding before we jump into it. So let's start with that. Okay, so here's what we're going to examine now. First of all, let's talk a little bit about the type of wounds that generally speaking occur during warfare, with a focus on the 19th century. And many are the type of wounds that we should expect. For instance, the most important and common ones would be fractures, dislocations, bruises, sprains, burns. And of course, in order to draw even the most basic analysis of the type of injuries and trauma and tissue damage that occurred during, for instance, the Battle of Aspens, the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleonic battlefields and death, we will be reading some stuff including peri-mortem trauma description. Now, for those of you who are not familiar, we do need to be familiar with the difference between antemortem, peri-mortem and post-mortem whenever we analyze damaged tissue. Antemortem clearly is before death, post-mortem is after death, but peri-mortem means, as I read, peri-mortem trauma occurs at or around the time of death, while antemortem trauma refers to injuries sustained before death, which show signs of healing. So we could describe peri-mortem as at or near the time of death. This, of course, can include all sorts of type of damage, for instance, blunt force trauma, sharp force trauma, projectile trauma. The latter is what we're going to focus on today. To frame this even better, let's ask a few questions. First, what is the maximum range and effective range of the type of cannons that we are examining? Clearly, this will depend. A 6-pounder will have a certain range, a 12-pounder will have a certain range, and clearly the rate of fire is going to be influenced by the type of projectile you choose to use. Of course, 6-pounders being able to be fired more quickly than 12-pounders with a ratio of 2 to 3. However, 12-pounder round shots could be fired at a longer range and more effectively when it comes to precision and accuracy. Whenever we talk about Napoleonic warfare, there is also a difference between foot artillery and horse artillery, in the sense that horse artillery is usually carried by horses, whereas foot artillery, as the name suggests, is pushed by hand. And normally, with exceptions, foot artillery formed the bulk of the firing batteries. To further answer that question and several others, there is a fantastic post made on Ask Historians by Led Baptist, the question being, what did cannonball impacts actually look like in 18th century warfare? I'll leave a link in the description. But when it comes to the range, we read, As a general rule, the maximum range of light guns was about 1,000 yards, while heavier pieces reached out to about twice that distance. The maximum effective range, however, was considerably less, given the inherent inaccuracy of the smoothbore gun, which had no rifling to impart a stable trajectory to its projectiles. Horizontal displacement of the trajectory was very marked at ranges over 800 yards. The maximum range for British practice was to fire shrapnel or round shots at range over 600 yards. So not only we shouldn't really focus our question onto what's the maximum range, but we should discuss what is the range that usually these were used at for maximum accuracy. We should also consider the type of targets involved, because you can use a high caliber gun to shoot at walls, to shoot at defenses, to try and breach enemy fortifications, but at the same time, if you try and take out one single person, it's going to be extremely difficult unless you're really, really close. But of course, if you shoot into packed formations of men, as we will read in a second, the damage could be devastating, because those would be very easy targets to hit in comparison. We also read round shot was the heaviest and longest range projectile available to gunners, so tactics of the era made good use of them. And this is the section when then he starts discussing how gunners of the era tried to position their cannons in order to deliver oblique fire and wipe out as many men as possible in packed formations. Having said that, let's discuss the injuries that these cannonballs could deal. There's quite a lot of data available when it comes to answering the question how lethal a cannonball would be if it hit a target in whichever way it did. Of course, I'll once again leave links in the description, but some of this data comes from detailed bioarchaeological studies that try to elucidate the impact of 19th century military artillery. And reviewing these, I've been reading quite a lot of articles before turning on the camera. I have to say that the level of stress that these soldiers must have been in, military life and single rank and file soldier life, was pushed to the extremes in the 19th century. Because not only once inspected and clear for actions, these cannons were, dreadful, but being on the receiving end, even if you weren't hit, just by seeing the number of men that were decimated when exposed to enemy fire must have been PTSD inducing, not to mention the immediate burial of the corpses that had to commence as soon as possible in order to avoid outbreaks of epidemics and infectious diseases. So not only you had just survived the battle, but you had to take care of and look at all the maiming and I can't even imagine it. But imagine we should. Let's read the sources. From the page Artillery Tactics and Combat Napoleonic Wars 1805 to 1815, we read, "The cannonball or round shot is a solid projectile without explosive charge fired from a cannon. The cannonballs were heavy. The projectile was cast iron spheres about 2 mm less in diameter than caliber of the cannon, otherwise it would cause jamming. The effects of direct hit were devastating." From 1807, we read, "Once the file touching me on the right was struck full in the chest, the shock was so violent that those next to the men struck were thrown down together with the poor wretches who were hit." Thomas Austin, officer of British infantry, was wounded by French cannonball. He writes, open quotes, "The instant after, another cannonball swept off my left leg below the knee joint, and although felled to the earth by the irresistible force of the blow, I experienced no sensation of faintness, but felt excessively hot, thirsty and savage. The moment after being struck down, I had sufficiently recovered from the shock, or more correctly, had not been prostrated by it, as to be able to sit up and examine my wound. I found the bones were laid bare for some distance up the limb, and appeared as white as the finest ivory, the tendons dangling and quivering like so many pieces of thread. Soon after receiving my wound, however, there came on a burning sensation in the injured part, which gradually spread over my whole frame, and I felt parching thirst, which seemed to have converted my tongue into a firebrand. The battlefield was, to me now, divested of all the excitement and dignity of glorious war." Direct shot. In direct shot, the cannonball was fired on the straight trajectory. At Dresden in 1813, a cannonball tore through General Moreau's thigh, passed through his horse, and shattered the other leg also. His leg was soon amputated by Tsar surgeon Wiley. He died a week later, and his body was embalmed and taken to St. Petersburg. Check this one out from 1813. Open quotes. "The cannonballs plowed through our ranks from the first to the last, each time sweeping away at least 30 men when they took the column full on." Gosh, 30 men. Unbelievable. Eylau in 1807, open quotes, "A Russian hussar officer watched in horror when a cannonball knocked down 8 soldiers in the Tobol musketeer Regiment. English and in league of the 52nd Foot, saw at Waterloo a French cannonball that struck 4 men near him. 2 men in the first and second rank fell outward. The 2 others fell within the square. 1 man made a horrible outcry on being wounded. At Borodino in 1812, General Montbrun of French cavalry was mortally wounded. Bios writes, open quotes, "I suddenly heard a dull thud. Someone had been wounded, I examined. At the same instant, General Montbrun rolled off his horse. The cannonball passed through his body from side to side, damaging his kidneys. Montbrun whispered, 'Excellent shot,' before losing consciousness and being carried to the rear." From the Peninsular War we read, open quotes, "Before we reached shelter, General St. Croix of the cavalry, an officer of the greatest merit, quite young, was cut in two in the midst of our ranks by a cannonball fired from an English gunboat stationed on the Tagus." This is from Memoirs of the French Napoleonic Officer, page 145. At Corunna in 1809, British commander General Sir John Moore was struck by a French cannonball and thrown from his saddle. He fell on his back at the feet of Colonel Graham's horse. A round shot had torn a hole so deep in his left shoulder that the lung was exposed, the ribs over the heart and part of the collarbone had been smashed, the muscles of the breast had been torn into strips, and the arm was hanging only by the sleeve of his coat and a shred of flesh. And then it goes into the sort of wounds by ricochet fire, one of which was crazy. Someone got hit and decapitated, and then the cannonball ricocheted, hit a tree, and then went back onto other soldiers. This is insane. And then, of course, they mentioned the Ronley ball, as I was telling you, that would crack bones and shatter legs. Oh my God. Then they have a whole section on the effects of canister fire, which when you have many small little pieces that explode and deal damage, I think we've read enough. Okay, so now that we have read these, I think it's not difficult to believe that a round cannonball could penetrate a chest plate like that, depending on range of course, and just keep going through, crushing everything going outside the other hand and probably hitting more soldiers on its way. We can read this. These cannonballs, specifically the round shot, where the power was incredible. 30 men, 8 men in a row. Insane stuff, insane stuff. I think sometimes, at least before reading all of this, the way I was imagining it is, oh, they hit someone and then they hit one guy and the guy falls on the ground, but I wasn't expecting 30 men in a row. I wasn't expecting making people, considering also the fact that these don't have explosive charge, I wasn't really expecting people to be thrown all the way around, but it did happen just because of the pure impact force. But now that we have all of this context, let's have a look at that article that thinks that the armor in question is a fake. So, it's important to underline, and now that we have read this, just for context, that even if he were to be correct, even if you are convinced at the end, I'm not really convinced, but even if you are, we read it and you're like, no, Metatron, you know what, I do think that this is a fake. It's not a fake because this would be impossible with period technology. It would absolutely be possible, as we read. It would be a fake just because it's a fake, right? Because fakes can happen. But the fact that this would be a fake, even if it were, it's important to remind that it wouldn't tell us, oh, this would be impossible. No, absolutely doable. Absolutely doable. Let's read. There are no perfect crimes, only failed investigations. So when a serious crime investigator goes wrong, when a serious crime investigation goes wrong, there should always be some sort of independent review, away from whichever agency undertook the original investigation. It's something I feel passionately about, especially after spending 5 years reinvestigating the disappearance of missing estate agent Susie Lemplaf, and uncovering a completely different truth, detailed on his book. Click the link in the description if you want to check that one out. In recent years, there have been many domestic homicide reviews and serious case reviews that refer to a lack of professional curiosity by investigators. It was also a term used by an inquest jury in its findings following the murder in our word of 4 men by Stephen Port. During the inquests, police admitted failing to carry out basic checks, failing to send evidence to be forensically examined, and failing to exercise professional curiosity during Port's 16-month killing spree conducted between June 2014 and September 2015. Why aren't investigators professionally curious enough to carry out even the most basic of checks and ask the relevant questions? And it's a very fair question, by the way. And it doesn't just happen in the world of criminal investigations. It goes on around us all the time. It's a type of confirmation bias or intellectual laziness which can sometimes arise when there is a fear of rocking the boat and upsetting colleagues, or perhaps when a false narrative suits someone's particular motives. So in this case, I think it's talking about the idea of, well, this is a famous piece, it's in this museum, they don't want it disrupted, and so they are not actually putting in the sufficient level of investigative work to be able to confirm the finding. This is the overall basis of this article. To give an example of this, last week a social media user tweeted a short video of a smashed and ruptured Napoleonic breastplate. The armor was said to belong to a French cavalryman of the 2nd Rifle Regiment who fought at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, and thanks to social media it has become a sensation with more than 17 million views at the time of writing. It would be fair to say that it is now the most well-known piece of armor in the world. But I don't know if it's the most known, but whatever. The armor in question consists of a breastplate and backplate fastened together at the shoulders and waist, and is known as a cuirass. This particular cuirass is on display at the Musée de l'Arme, Army Museum in Paris, as the Musée de l'Armée, am I reading it wrong? Armée, Arme, you'll let me know, points out on its website, open quotes, in itself, breastplate of this type are not exceptional, close quotes. In fact, hundreds of them were taken as souvenirs from the Battle of Waterloo. Hundreds more probably survived unused in French army stores' rooms after metal body armor became obsolete. Many have found their way into museums and private collections across Europe since the battle. You can even buy something similar on eBay. Yeah, when you buy it on eBay, you've got to be very careful though. Better do that with an antiques arms and armor expert. So what makes this particular piece of armor exceptional? This Napoleonic cuirass is pierced right through, front and back, by what appears to have been a cannonball. A chest-height cannonball has punctured a neat hole in the shiny brass surface of the breastplate before it has apparently ripped through the persons wearing it and exited from the backplate. At the rear, the exit hole is larger and fiercer, the twisted and torn metal of the backplate at odds with the neat hole seen at the front. Right, it's this ghastly mutilation of the cuirass that has made it so special and evocative of that damp day in June 1815. For many, it illustrates the barbarity of the defeat suffered by Napoleon's army at Waterloo at the hands of the British. Our imagination is captured by the power of the cannon launching a single metal ball at somewhere close to 400 miles per hour directly at the man sitting on a horse. That happened quite a lot, as we could read. As we look at the ravaged armor, we can smell the gunpowder, taste the soot in the air, feel the pain of the soldier as he realized he's about to die, the cannonball hurling towards him, most likely ripping off his arm and decapitating him. I don't know why he's saying this, because obviously this didn't happen. As it carries on through him and into the battlefield behind. Tony Pollard, a professor in conflict history and archaeology at Glasgow University, tweeted about the find. Open quotes. This cuirass was worn by a French cavalryman in 4th Company, 2nd Carabinier Regiment at Waterloo on 18th of June 1815. His name was Antoine Fauveau. He was 23 years old and he died sabre in hand. He not long been conscripted and he had benefited for no more than 7 days of training. Close quote. So this is confirmed by a professor at the University of Glasgow. A professional is pushing it as real. And then Mr. Pollard says, open quotes, around 4 p.m. French put in cavalry charges against Wellington's centre right, famously under more of a slog up a muddy hill than a gallop. By the end, 10,000 horsemen had engaged in the messy ebb and flow against allied cavalry, artillery and infantry arranged in squares. We continue throwing more men into this meat grinder didn't help, but 1st and 2nd Carabiniers ordered forward against 20 guns from east edge of Hugh Mount at 6:30 p.m. Men and horses slodged uphill to be met by musket and cannon. The reserve division made 3 advances, but each time repulsed. Okay, so we go back to the article. The tweets were shared many thousands of times. Professor Pollard even predicted the size of the cannon and where it was when it was fired, before concluding, open quotes, over the next 10 days, bodies were stripped and then buried or burnt. Every item or hardware and clothing was recycled or sold, and the field became a tourist attraction. The cuirass a prized trophy. The bloody plate was pulled from his body before pitching him into a mass grave. Close quotes. As former police detective with Scotland Yard, my professional curiosity is explosive. As a former police detective with Scotland Yard, my professional curiosity in explosive firearms and ordnance and their effects on the human body was piqued by this fascinating story. In particular, why was the size of the hole in the backplate completely at odds with the hole in the breastplate? That's actually not at odds, I don't think. He kind of goes against this, but if you read the type of damage dealt Even by soft lead bullets of the American Civil War, that's what they would do. They would enter clean in the front, and then they would be smashed because of their material, and as they exit the wound, they would create a several times larger wound at the back. That's, in my experience, what I read. He's at odds with this. Exit wounds from gunshots are often much larger than their entry point. This is due to a variety of reasons, from muzzle velocity, type of gun, type of bullet, and what damage different types of bullets inflict inside a human body. Great. But in this case, we are talking about a piece of solid metal, a spherical iron ball. Cannonballs don't fragment upon striking a human body as musket shots or modern bullets do. Good point. Thus, one would expect the exit wound from the backplate to be similar size to the entrance hole on the front of the breastplate. To check how different the two holes were, I carried out simple relative length distance measurements on the photos of the cuirass available on the museum website. Based on a known reference object size, in this case the height of the cuirass, I was able to then measure the size of the entry and exit holes. As the attached images show, this proves that the exit hole, 18 centimeters, was 1.5 times larger than the entry hole, 12 centimeters. As you may now recognize, this presents two problems for the authenticity of the cuirass and how it was mutilated. It is well known that the largest piece of artillery the British had and its allies on the battlefield of Waterloo was 9-pound cannon. These 9-pound cannons fired solid metal cannonballs of 4 inches or 10 centimeters in diameter, too small to have made a 12-inch entry hole in the breastplate of the cuirass. The French had larger artillery on the battlefield in their day, but even their larger cannons fell slightly short of being able to make a 12 centimeters hole. Through professional curiosity, a number of important questions and thus raised, a process that all investigators, museum and indeed historians should be doing. I agree with him on this. We should ask the questions and investigate. With these anomalies in mind, I started to look a little deeper at the provenance of the cuirass in question. How did it come into the possession of the museum? Was it, as some have suggested, picked off the lifeless body of the victim on the day of the battle before the victim was thrown into a mass grave? The museum website states, open quotes, unearthed by a farmer, it was immediately acquired by Colonel Liechtenstein. The colonel, a descendant of an officer of the First French Empire, collected memorabilia from the Napoleonic era. An officer of the President of the Republic between 1879 and 1887, Philippe Liechtenstein, was staying at the displaced palace, and by a curious turn of fate, this relic would come to illustrate the Emperor's ultimate defeat and embody the sacrifice of the French soldiers in the Palais de la République. The collector patiently reconstructed the background of the breastplate and its wearer, and in order to keep this story alive, long after the protagonist died, he collected it, shared the story, and passed it on to subsequent generations through a donation to the museum's collections. The first thing of note here is that the cuirass is said to have been unearthed by a farmer when Philippe Liechtenstein was an officer at the palace between 1879 and 1887. Has this cuirass really been in the ground for 60 to 70 years? Questions the article writer. There isn't a spot of rust on it. Well, this question, sir, museums always polish and repair stuff. So, like, there is a lot of medieval stuff that is, I understand, and that in the earth, you maybe it's the soil that makes you question it, but a lot of the stuff that we see in museums comes from the soil. The swords, they get polished. Museums restore artifacts. They don't just showcase artifacts in their original conditions. There is a lot of work that goes into it. So already this question kind of makes me feel like maybe you don't know how the process works in museums. The second point is that Philippe Liechtenstein is the one who constructed the original story some 60 years after he had allegedly taken place, and then that's fair, and Philippe Liechtenstein served at the palace under the president of France. So he's saying maybe it's a propaganda piece. Grévy was known for his fierce political opposition to Charles-Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, who had engaged in the Second Italian War of Independence, as well as the disastrous Franco-Prussian War. Charles-Louis' uncle was Napoleon's Bonaparte, the man who had commanded the Napoleonic Wars, which culminated in the Battle of Waterloo, the very place that the mutilated cuirass is said to have been worn by a now dead cavalryman. Well, yes, but the Battle of Waterloo does have a lot of artifacts. More than that, when Grévy came to power in 1879, he famously said, open quotes, "I will never enter into battle against national wishes expressed by its institutional bodies," close quotes. Could this cuirass simply be a piece of political propaganda enabled by Philippe Liechtenstein at the behest of Grévy to show the human cost of brutality of war? I turn then to the alleged victim. What of the young man named as François Antoine Fauveau by the museum, who was said to have been killed wearing it? Well, here's the thing. it is possible, but if it is, I guess the museum would know. And why would the historian from the professor, Mr. Pollard, where did he get it? That would be something. If I'll see if I can get in contact with the professor and maybe make a part 2, because if he can give me proof of all the information, because he gave a lot of information on the post, where did he get it? Where did he read it? Is it primary sources or is it secondary sources? Because if it's secondary sources, then the guy who's writing the article may have a point. We may be repeating stuff that isn't substantiated by primary sources. The museum website claims that Francois Antoine had blue eyes, an aquiline nose, small mouth, dimpled chin, chestnut hair and eyebrows, face marked with wrinkles. He measured 179 meters, which probably favored his entry into the elite corps of the riflemen assigned May 21st, 1815 to the 2nd Rifle Regiment, commanded by Colonel Francois Bognat, and part of the 4th Squadron, 4th Company. He died on the field of honor less than a month later, June 18, 1815, in Waterloo. Possible. But many historians since the Cuirass went on display claim that it could not have been Francois Antoine who died on the battlefield, because his subsequent marriage certificate demonstrated that he was very much alive sometime later at his wedding ceremony. Interesting. How on earth could it have been the same man who died on the battlefield wearing the armor that day at Waterloo? Well, of course, there is the possibility that he survived the shot and then it is the same man, he just didn't die at the battle. That is a possibility. All of this should have put the museum in a very difficult situation. There should have been at least some sort of investigation to prove that this cuirass is what it purports to be. I absolutely agree. Why hasn't someone carried out an investigation and written all this up in a report for us to read? Yep. This is where some individuals close their minds to the obvious and carrying on being intellectually dishonest with everyone around them to protect the integrity of the organization they work for, or in this case, the integrity of the museum exhibit. Instead of a complete reinvestigation, many have tried to smooth over the biggest and most important question: how on earth did Francois Antoine live through this astonishing injury? But that can happen, sir. The armor's background story has been changed, even on some official museum catalogues, and another legend inserted. It is now said that when his call-up papers arrived, Francois Antoine was on the verge of getting married, thus a friend or relatives, or even a paid replacement somehow joined up and became part of this elite fighting force and died in his place. Really? He says. In my honest opinion, I don't think anyone died wearing this particular cuirass at the Battle of Waterloo. In fact, I don't think anyone ever died wearing it. The evidence of this is the size of the hole in the backplate. Cannonballs don't disintegrate when they enter or come into contact with a human body, and soft body tissue and bone are not strong enough to have enlarged the exit hole on a solid metal backplate, tearing the metal 1.5 times larger than the entry hole. Whatever was inside the cuirass when it was shot with a cannon that we know the British didn't have at Waterloo, was hard and solid, and that's what existed from the backplate this is what exited from the backplate as the cannonball passed through it, creating a larger exit hole. So he's presenting the idea that they still did shoot it, but they shot it with a different cannon that was more powerful, I guess. But then again, it still creates the problem. How did they do it then? If they shot it, wouldn't it still go out with the same size, if that's your argument? That's my question. I'm sorry to say, we read, that I think the exhibit itself is a complete fake, and that all the evidence suggests this to be the case. Why haven't these questions been asked before? To do so would ruin the narrative. Yeah, okay, now it goes a little bit into... I'm not going to call it a conspiracy, because I don't think this man has anything to gain. It's just his professional curiosity. But it does become a little bit, I mean, if you say, well, this would ruin the narrative, would unpick the evocative and painful story embroidered over the years, which has been made people stare at this exceptional cuirass. It was not in the financial interest of the farmer, the collector, of the museum to carry out this investigation, just as it was not in the political interest of those who brought the original story to the public attention. To some investigators, the truth is unimportant. The only desire is to support an already carefully installed narrative. Yeah, but I don't know what the narrative does now. I'm sure the museum has got multiple pieces, and it's not like we need to spread this political interest of this person from hundreds of years ago. So it's a little weak, in my opinion, Mr. Videset, but it is interesting that you ask, and I think you absolutely, it's well written, the article, and it's something that we will investigate more. I'm going to look into it even more deeply, and I will see if I can contact Mr. Pollard and see if he can give me primary sources to indicate how he made the statements that he made using social media. Anyways, this is a little bit of a precursory or introductory discussion to this topic, not only the topic of this specific cuirass and asking the question, then now we can all continue to discuss. And if you have evidence to the contrary of what's been stated or in favor of what's been stated on this last article, please let me know in the comments so that we can further go into a deeper analysis and perhaps even make a second episode, and who knows, together with the professor, we could find some answers to this question. But most importantly, I think it was a video also to present the tremendous reality of the sort of ghastly wounds and damage that cannons and 19th century field artillery could deal on the human body. If you found any of this interesting, please consider sharing, leaving a comment, liking and subscribing, becoming a noble one, and thank you very much for watching. See you tomorrow.